I'm just going to clean up these diaphragm blades, and I'm just using some naphtha on a cotton bud. Now these diaphragm blades look relatively clean to me. The diaphragm blades are not symmetrical. The little pivots are closer to the centre line of the blade at one end and closer to the edge of the blade on the other. That's important when you go to reassemble the diaphragm, that they all go in the correct way around. So I normally, as I clean them, I lay them out in the same direction so that when I go to pick them up to place them on the plate, the retainer plate, that it's easy to get them all in the correct way around. If the blades are quite oily, they'll tend to bind together, and that can be a problem if the aperture setting lever is forced and the blades don't want to move. Something's going to give. Either the pivots pull out of position, that they come out of their holes that they're socketed into, or pivots might tear out of the blade altogether, or alternatively lesser damage may occur. One of the common things that you see is that the blades are distorted, particularly if the forces are acting to push on the blade from each end. The blades may become distorted, and that makes them a bit stiffer in their action to move once they've been cleaned, but it also means that it's very difficult to reassemble the diaphragm if the blades are not lying flat. Shutter blades, if they show marking from typically from corrosion, sometimes oil staining, you can polish the blades with some metal polish. Brasso is what I tend to use. But diaphragm blades, I rarely polish those, because diaphragm blades have the little pivots on them, and of course they're easy to catch a cleaning cloth or a cotton bud on those pivots and ending up damaging the blade or distorting it badly, which is effectively the same thing. Sometimes, of course, if the blades are quite bad with corrosion, there's nothing for it but to polish the blades as best you can. That's not normally the case. Right, well, I've got my blades there all clean, and I can reassemble these diaphragm components. First I put the retaining plate in place. Now the retaining plate is completely flat on one side and has 5 small dimples in the other. The dimpled side goes down on this jig. Then I can start putting my diaphragm blades in place, and the pivots that I'm putting into the plate are the pivots that are closer to the centre line of the blade, I'd like to say that these blades were lying down nice and flat, but they're not. So the first 6 blades are easy to get in position, but now we've got to pull back the earlier blades because they are covering the holes we need to fit the later blades into. So I'll swing these blades out. It's at this point where you're swinging these blades out that the pivots at the other end of them may come out of their respective holes, and that's exactly what's happened here. But I'm hopeful that I can rescue that situation. If the blades had been lying flatter, that wouldn't have been so likely to happen. But this blade in particular looks like it's lifted out of its pivot hole at the other end. It's not at all uncommon to have 2 or more attempts at getting this diaphragm assembled. That blade is certainly quite cupped. Does not want to lie down flat. Now I've got to swing the first blades over the top. Swing everything back into position. And here you can see that the spacing of the pivots is completely uneven, meaning that one of these blades is out of position. Probably that one. That one there's moving too, so I've got 2 pivots that are not in position correctly. I'm going to see if I can rescue that situation. Here is the plate, the moving plate that swings the blades in and out. This will be fun. I know from experience it goes right here. Let's see if I can get these pivots in correctly. Two of them are out, that one there. And the other one, which is right around there, needs to be dragged back into line. Of course, that's just the pivots in the moving plate that I've got into position. I know that one or more of those pivots is incorrect on the other plate, the fixed plate. Anyway, as that stands, I can assemble the case to that, which also goes on in only one position. The fluff there, that's where the cotton is caught on that alignment screw at the back of the case. So that's assembled. I can flip that over, lift off the outer part of my jig, put it on and underneath to support things, and find the screws that hold all that together. There will be 3, one of them is countersunk. That's it there. Right, there's my screwdrivers, and I've just been busy putting some heat shrink tubing on my screwdrivers to colour code them so they're easy to find out which one I'm looking for. inevitably you can't get heat shrink tubing to match the colours you've used previously, so one of these screwdrivers is a different colour than it used to be. So I have to get used to that. So I'll get these 3 screws started. I won't tighten them up yet. Just run them down lightly. And I've got to check the pivot points here. Now there's nothing in the pivot point in the hole here or here or here, so I've got 3 blades out of position. If I can swing those into position. Loosen that screw up slightly in case I got it too tight. No, that's not tight. I can just see the pivot here. I can pull that into position. And the one here. I've got 2 in position. One is still not correctly positioned there. I can just see it through the opening. Just pulling that into line with the tip of my tweezers. Right, that's it. That plate just dropped down and seated. I'll run those screws up lightly. Check the action of the diaphragm. Yeah, that's moving correctly. Do the 3 screws up. And that's the blades back in the case. They're not especially free running. There's not a lot of drag there, but it's certainly noticeable. And that is almost certainly due to the fact that some of those blades are not dead flat. That won't cause us any trouble. We have the setting lever. I'll find the screws for that. And the setting lever, I'm just going to wipe a bit of molybdenum paste on that setting lever where it comes in contact with the back of the case. And it looks like I'm doing nothing at all, where there's not much actually being applied here. The setting lever goes on that way up. Probably stick that on that jig. Making sure the holes in the moving plate and the setting lever are all aligned through the notches in the fixed retainer plate. That's 1 screw in position. The other screw in position. Now check that that's all connected and working, and it's smooth. It's smooth in its action. It's not overly loose. Got a good feel to it. You've got to remember the diaphragm settings have no click stop. So if they're too loose, they're too easily accidentally shifted. But that's good. That feels fine. So I'm quite happy with the state of that. I can move on to dealing with the rest of the shutter. And the rest of the shutter in this case, of course, we start with the mechanism plate. So this can go out and this can come in. I'll start by removing the lever here that operates the blade actuating ring. There's a single screw holds that in position. And there's a washer here, a shim washer, exceptionally fine shim washer. It's been used to take up a bit of slack. Just means that there's a discrepancy between the thickness of this lever and the height of that post. And it's just to take out any undue rattle. Some shutters have a washer there, some do not. Most do not. 1, 2, 3, 4 screws hold the retainer plate here in place. 3 short and 1 long. Important to keep a lot of pressure on your screwdriver. Have your screwdriver in a good condition so that the screw heads don't get overly distorted and that you don't slip. That's the 3 short screws. The long screw here next to that mounting screw for the retard gear train. And the reason there are 3 short screws is because if they protruded through the mechanism plate on the other side, they'd catch on stuff if they were long. Right, so there's the retainer. Here's our blade actuating ring, and here's our mechanism plate. Now, typically I don't remove the retard gear train from the mechanism plate because getting the speeds adjusted correctly is a real trial. That certainly needs to be cleaned, it's sluggish in its action, and I'll deal with that with some naphtha. Everything else will just get cleaned with naphtha on a cotton bud. There's usually not much to go wrong with these. So I'll do that next. I'll start with the mechanism plate. So I'm just cleaning the top surface around the lens tube. And you have to be careful not to damage the hairspring. There's a hairspring here on the retard gear train. If I hold the pallets out from engagement with my finger, swing this arm across, release that, it holds that hairspring fully wound up out of harm's way. And it means that I can wipe around the lens tube at that point without damaging the hairspring. You'll be careful of this spring here too. This is the return spring for the lever that operates the blade actuating ring. You don't want to damage that. I'll just wipe the inside surface of that lens tube. There's not much dirt coming off there. And the underside of the mechanism plate. Frequently you'll find grease, or particularly graphite grease, in positions like this. Often it's gone all dry and sticky and needs to be completely cleaned away. Well, that's good. Now this retard gear train, I'm just going to run a bit of naphtha on that. Hold back the pallets and work that repeatedly. And what I'm doing is I'm flushing away old oil, dust and dirt that's got in there. particularly the oils. Oil is a real problem. Old oils and grease is a real problem. Over time the volatiles go away and you're left with the other stuff, and it can get very sticky. So here I'm flushing it out with solvent and I'm blowing it away. You don't just put solvent on there and let the solvent evaporate. If you put solvent on there and let the solvent evaporate, when the solvent is gone, you're back with the sticky crap you started off with. If you have the rubbish suspended in the solvent and you blow the solvent away, it's taking the rubbish with it. That's moving nicely now. That's nice and prompt in its action. It even sounds clean, sounds metallic. You hear the whiz of the teeth. You weren't hearing that before because everything was covered in a layer of dirt. Well, that's good. I'll put that to one side. I do notice something here, and that's the retard gear train is adjusted by swinging the retard gear train closer to the centre here, which actually acts to relieve the pallets because this control lever is more an engagement, and at the other end, at this end here, it changes the amount of interaction you get between this lever and the main ring, the main lever they call it, the main acting ring, cocking ring of the shutter. I notice at this end that is pushed all the way inwards, which would tend to speed the shutter up, particularly at the slower speeds. It looks suspiciously far in, so I wouldn't be at all surprised if I don't have to make some adjustment to the speeds when I come to put that back together. But in the meantime, let's clean up these other components. There's not much coming away on here. This is all quite clean. Likewise, the blade actuating ring, there's not much coming away on this. Okay, well, the blade actuating ring can be lubricated with graphite powder. Sometimes I use molybdenum paste. You see me rubbing at that with my fingers, it's because there's more on there than I really would like. There shouldn't be much more than just a faint dirty mark when you've got enough on there. That should be okay. Let's pop that in position. There's a pin on this that couples to the lever that operates it, so the pin goes downwards in a little hole there, a little notch. It's not hard to see where that goes. And this blade only goes on in one position. It's actually got a locating rivet which positions it and holds it in one spot. Now there are 4 screws. Well, 3 of the short ones can go straight in. With these screws, get them all in place, then tighten them up. If you go mad and tighten one up before you put the others in place, inevitably you'll find that it has pulled things out of line and you cannot get the other screws to start. and the long screw goes in this position. These screws would originally have been locked in place with Loctite or something like Loctite. But there was no real sign that that was the case when I took it apart. Just checking the action of that blade actuating ring. It's nice and smooth. So this lever, the screw and the washer, the spacer, that's shim. I'll clean the lever. I'm looking closely at the lever to make sure there's no corrosion, particularly on the underside. Otherwise you'd end up with high friction at this point. Likewise the screw and the washer, that shim. That looks fine. So the blade actuating ring, the lever rather, I'll just run some molybdenum paste through the pivot point and through the slot where it couples to the blade actuating ring. Now this had a shim washer to start off with, so we'll put it back. It has to be positioned carefully to get it around the centre of that post. If it slides across, it'll be sitting on top of the post and it won't be doing the job it was intended to do. Run that screw down, tighten that, check the action. That's smooth. There's no undue rattle. That action appears snappy, that's good. For lubricating the retard gear train, I'm going to use graphite powder. The downside of graphite powder is that you need to blow away all the loose graphite powder afterwards, because otherwise it'll inevitably settle on the glass surfaces as tiny little sparkles.